Okay. Can I get a thumbs up if people can see the screen? Great. Okay, so I'll just start with a little bit more of an introduction of the work we're doing. So as I mentioned, this is a partnership between the Education Systems Center and ELP. And this is a 10-week project that's scratching the surface really in terms of developing a proposal for what a community-wide approach to data use could look like within the ELP footprint of District 189. And this is meant to be a kickstart, a foundation, not the end of this project. And so the ambition would be that this document, this project can serve as a stepping stone for future work, helping to just provide a menu of options, give some considerations for decisions and implementation that would happen in the future. The first thing I wanted to say before diving into things that are new is looking backwards on what we've learned in this community related to the use of data. And so there are two projects I wanted to call out in particular and talk a little bit about what we've learned from them. So the first one is EDI, which I imagine many of you are familiar with. It came up in the last meeting I was part of, the Early Development Instrument, which was a partnership with the Erickson Institute to be able to understand geographically where some of these vulnerabilities across developmental domains were. And it was updated twice since 2016. And from what I've heard, there's been a little bit of mixed views related to this. Some people find it incredibly helpful and say they've used it in their work since then. Others have said that it was hard to understand, hard to figure out what to make actionable about it. The other thing that's interesting about this project is it shows that there's real willingness in this community to work together to build a product or build a tool that everyone can collaboratively use and can make the outcomes of all students in the community better. And finally, I heard that there's interest in continuing to be able to measure based on the most up-to-date information. The next project I wanted to highlight is work that has also been done at Eastside Aligned in its Youth Development Alliance. So for those who are not familiar, the Youth Development Alliance focuses largely on middle and high school students, as I understand it, with after-school programming. And through that work, they've had a project running for several years actually with the school district to be able to link up data from students in school and the same students in their after-school programs. So being able to track students in after-school programs, their attendance, their grades, things like that. And so what this tells us is that it is possible for ELP, for ESA to partner with organizations like the school district, as well as hopefully others, perhaps Head Start or even small and individual care centers to be able to match student data with individual outcomes and to be able to take away insights for the broader community. I also learned through this work that when it comes to individual providers, in this case, after school program coordinators, receiving that data back for their students, there was a wide range of comfort levels and ability levels in terms of making good use of that data. And so one thing that YDA found particularly important was being able to support, train, and just be there for those providers as they worked through that data. We learned that this can be at times very time intensive, and so looking for ways early on to make sure this is as seamless as possible, and understanding that this is the kind of project where you can really there's a lot of things you could do, but we're always limited by time and the people we have available to do that work. So those are some considerations that we're learning and going into this new project with. And after this slide, I'll pause and get some early reactions, but from the conversations I've had so far, 3 key themes came up about what we would want a system like this to be able to do. What are the things that we don't know now that we would want to be able to answer to be able to be more competitive for grants, to be able to change curriculum and programming to better serve families, to have greater kindergarten readiness in this community? And it came down to 3 things. The first was enrollment. The second were family and student needs. And the third was workforce preparedness and support. So I'll flip the slide, which talks a little bit more about specifically some details that fall into each of these buckets. So let me pause here and ask if anyone has any questions or early reactions. So anything I said so far surprised anyone? Okay, I'll keep going then. So in these three areas that have come up across the various conversations I've had with folks in the community, there are three types of things we want to be able to know. And we think that a collaborative approach to data can help us do that better. First is the most basic around enrollment. How many students are actually being served by the various providers in our community? What kind of services are they getting? Where are those services? Who are these students? What kind of background do they come from? What are their households like? And then also, what about the people that aren't being served? Is there a percentage of eligible students in this community that are not getting services? Moving on to the second bucket, similarly thinking about the demand that families have, what do they need that isn't being met? Whether common ideas that I've heard so far are specifically around non-traditional services, and also hours. So non-traditional hours, weekends, evenings, overnights, those kinds of things. And finally, what is the impact of the level of service provision in this community? What does that do for kindergarten readiness? And if there are changes that we make, to our programming or to the level of service we have, how does that impact our kindergarten readiness levels? And finally, how is our workforce prepared and supported in this work? What is the profile of our early learning workforce? What kinds of skills and credentials do they have and still need to do their job at the highest level? And also, what kind of access to professional development and support do they have? And so you might be asking around this time, how do we actually learn more about those things? And that's where the vision of how the system could work comes into play. And this is a very two-dimensional early sketch. There's a lot of detail that would have to come in between here and the final version to actually make this real, but this gives you an idea of how it could work. In the center here, you have this idea of a system in gray, and the different purple boxes around it show you different stakeholders and people with data that would be informing the system. So I'll start at the very top where it says governing body. What that essentially means, that would be a body that is not necessarily directly a service provider. It might be, but its main job in this capacity is to define what kind of data is collected, to organize and produce reports, to share, make sure everything is running smoothly, and to update, for example, if we want to start collecting a new type of data down the line, going through the process of figuring that out, working with others in the community to make those decisions and putting them into action. They're going to be getting inputs from individual providers, from folks at the state, regional level, as they make those decisions. Going down to the bottom, then you have all the individual providers. So these are, these are the folks who are going to not only be contributing data in the form of their operational data in terms of attendance, number of enrolled students, things like that. They also then have the chance to both influence the governing body and also get back information from the system in the form of these reports about their site that tell them things that they might not have easily been able to understand on their own about, the profile of their students, how that compares to other sites or even state type averages, and what they might be able to do differently to improve their support of their workforce and of their families and students. And last but not least, on the side here, you see governor's office and state agencies. So the state has already, for the last several years, been undertaking a pretty extensive project to stand up a very similar system at the state level. And also, Chicago has also been doing something similar at their local level. So there are things that they've already started putting in motion that they could feed back into a system like this once they've hit a certain point. So for example, there might be some data that doesn't have to be collected at the local level because the state already has it. There also could be things like if the state has new requirements that it's going to be putting into grants, that could be something that they share that then informs what data is collected. And similarly, they would also get data back, probably most likely through the governing body that helps them understand what's happening in East St. Louis so they can make decisions, hopefully, that support East St. Louis in furthering its goals. So that was a lot that I just said. Let me pause and let that sink in for a bit. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about this model?
Yes, I have, it's not so much a question, it's like a comment that I'm thinking of. I hear can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, I hear so many service providers talking about services that they have, services that they provide for families and just services all day, but yet it's still families that need services and don't know what services are, but yet still service providers always talk about these services they have for families and how to access these services, but families are not getting the services that they need. And they almost, it makes me wonder, what services are you providing for the families if families keep saying that they need services and don't have services?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's something that, while this system doesn't directly change, it could give us hopefully blueprints to make a difference in that pattern. So for example, I've heard from folks saying, well, we increased the number of slots that were available, but that didn't necessarily increase the number of students who were enrolled. What that tells me is that maybe there's a mismatch between what slots are available and what the families who are looking for care really need. And so in an ideal world, what a system like this would be able to do is be able to say, well, okay, in this neighborhood, the families, the parents largely work evening shifts. And so they're looking for childcare for their children at night. But even though we may have the same number of slots as students, they're only available during the day in this particular subsection of the community. That could be something we take away and say, okay, well, then that means we really need to prioritize getting funding and resources for, evening time slots, for example. And that's one way that hopefully a system like this could help us break down those barriers between what's available and what providers are saying that they have and what families are looking for and need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what you said made sense, but just the comment that I made about service providers, that don't make sense to me.
Yeah.
I just want to add something really quick, if you don't mind.
Please.
So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, when we say providers in this bottom box that's got the dashed line, really that means early learning providers. So family child care centers and Head Start and preschool for all. So just wanted to look that up. That could be a slight adjustment, Alexis, that we make on that.
Yep, happy to do that.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Now I'm back on track now.
Got it. Okay. So the last thing on this piece before we start moving into talking a little bit more about, having conversations around data and its value is this piece around design principles. So like I said, this model that we just looked at it's a very 2D early depiction of what this could look like. There's going to be a lot of decisions that have to be made between now and a system like this actually being in place. And there will be a lot of people involved in making those decisions. And so what this slide is trying to do is articulate what are some guidelines and principles that we could be using to actually make those decisions. The first one is the idea of being generative. One thing that you hear when you talk to people about education and data is a concern that people are going to use data against them. The idea that if, for example, the students in their program have a test score or a metric that looks a little bit lower than someone else's, that's going to be used to say that they're doing their job poorly, that they should not have access to funding, et cetera, et cetera. We want to work on building a system that doesn't look at it that way, that looks on finding insights, solutions, improvements, and never about placing blame or taking punitive action. This is about, identifying where people need support, where people need resources, where we can come together as a community and make things better, not, again, be pointing fingers. The second one is around being equitable and, using this data as an engine to continue identifying and addressing systemic inequalities and inequities, particularly for, students and families with particular need and lack of access to these resources historically. The third one is to be collaborative. In a system like this, whether it's in education, in healthcare, or really any area, a lot of times the different pieces of the puzzle are owned by different people and they're in different silos. And it's very hard to sometimes break down those walls to bring the pieces together to really see the big picture and move things forward for a community. And so one commitment that's important and one thing we should be designing around to the best of our ability is encouraging collaboration and working together to increase everyone's outcomes and our shared objectives. And finally, thinking about security. We're talking about data that of individual students and families. And so of course it's of utmost importance that is held in a way that is where privacy is protected, where that data is secure. This is a very valid concern, but there are a lot of things you can do to mitigate it and make sure that information is kept safe. So that's another thing we'd want to think about and design for from the very beginning. So soon I'll transition into another piece where I talk about some things we can do, members of the community, to increase familiarity and comfort with data. Because I think that's one thing, going back to that workforce bucket, for example, that has jumped out as something that can happen early on. Some systems like these take a long time to put in place. But one thing we can do early on to make sure people, to help support such a system is to help people feel more comfortable with data in the first place. So I'm going to transition to talking about that. But before I do, does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Okay, we can keep moving then. So as I said, so I'm based at Education Systems Center for my fellowship. And one thing out of many that EdSystems has done in the past is to do workshops related to data with various community collaborative groups and other stakeholders. So what I've done is pulled just a few slides. This is not, I'm not going to do a workshop with you all now. But rather I wanted to show you some example materials that could be used in a workshop in the future. I think this is something that, in our final product, we'll be laying out action steps for, how we can move towards a stronger, more collaborative use of data in the future. And one of those early steps that we think that can happen within the next 6 months to a year is just starting to educate people in the system about why data is important. And how they can make the most of it, even without doing anything with bringing data from various sources together. Just how are they using the data that's in specifically their work today? So in a workshop like this, we want to cover a variety of different topics, some of which you'll see here. We want to talk about why data is important, what kind of things we can learn from data, how to embed a practice and a habit of using data, where to find it, what kind of questions to ask, especially when you're working collaboratively, And then also things like how to work on data in a virtual context. So I think the first thing to start with when speaking to any group about data, there's various comfort levels, is thinking about why do we even use it in the first place? You know, and I think there are two main purposes that are reflected here on this slide. One is to look out. This is the window metaphor. Thinking about how we can support students, schools, districts, looking at systems that maybe we're not part of in our specific work, but we're trying to influence. The other way is to think about data as a mirror, which means looking at our own programs, our own work, our own students, and what insights we have about our own practices and what changes we can make to be better. And so I think throughout, through a system like this and throughout each individual's work, you'll likely do both. The other thing that's really important in this work around the use of data equity focus. And so what I have here are two examples of graphs that show different types of data usage. On the left-hand side here, these are examples from high school data for dual credit enrollment programs. But the point I want to make is that on the left, you have grade level aggregated data. You have 10th grade in blue, 11th grade in orange, and then 12th grade in gray. And you see one number for the whole grade. That tells you some pieces of information. But if you look at the right-hand side, this is a disaggregated graph, which means that we're looking at one grade and breaking it down by ethnic group. So you see Hispanic students in 12th grade in yellow, green for Black students, and blue for white students. And this then gives you a little bit more information about how students of different ethnic groups are enrolling in these programs, which gives you more of an insight into the equity of these programs. And so disaggregated data in particular is a tool that's going to be really helpful, especially when you're trying to evaluate equity and access with your data. So we've talked a little bit about what data is, but we also want to think about why data is and why we're using it in our work. This model is a theory of action about data in education. It starts at the very foundation with conditions for data use. So what is the quality of the data that we're putting into our systems or analyses? What kind of capacity do we have, both in terms of time and skill, to work on data? And what is the culture we're working in around data? Right now, this is where a lot of the conversation is. Everything that we just talked about with respect to, building systems and training people on how to use data is really about changing the conditions for data use, making it so that it's more of a habit for people, that they know what to do with it. And also, even earlier on in the process, that the data that they have is high quality. So that goes back to what is collected and by various sources, whether it's individual providers or more collective entities. But that's not the end all be all. What's really important to not lose sight of, even when we're getting really deep into the details about data capacity or techniques for analyzing data, is the why we're doing it. And the why is what is in those steps in green and yellow above. We want to use data and have good conditions for data to take data-driven actions, which means implement policies and programs and practices that are that we know are better because the data behind them supports that they're going to lead to better outcomes. And finally, at the very top, we have results. All of the conditions for data use and data-driven action should be in service of improving outcomes and experiences for students and for families. So I would re-edit that to say achievement and experience. So, not only test scores, but are students supported, are students safe, all of those things is why we use data. So I think sometimes when we're getting in the really technical pieces of it, it's very easy to lose sight of that. But I think keeping all three of these levels in mind at all times helps it make sure that we're not just doing analysis for analysis sake, or doing things that are not really going to be impacting students at the end of the day, but really keep our work focused on improving outcomes for families. So that's a little bit about how we use data, whether we're working alone or together. But there are a few things that are important to think about specifically when working collectively around data. You know, one of the biggest things are these first 2 points here, is that, and this is true for any kind of collaborative effort, but there has to be a shared commitment across the various stakeholder groups and a clearly articulated vision. And without those two pieces, you might have people working in the same system, but they're not actually moving towards the same goals. So one of the biggest things that this project is going to be trying to do is synthesize perspectives from a lot of different stakeholders and put forward proposals around a vision, around goals that can be validated and put into action down the line. You know, you also need additional things like accountability for who's responsible for what, trust. You need leadership and proper governance to make sure that everything is used the way it's supposed to, and that everyone is playing their role, has the access they're supposed to have. And just a shared commitment in the value of data and the improvements it can make in students' lives and outcomes. So you'll hear kind of a buzzword a lot when it comes to data, which is a data-driven culture. What does that really mean? To me, what it means is that the use of data is not an anomaly. It's actually folded into day-to-day work, into your mindsets when it comes to serving students. And this image here shows a cycle that you can go through to help build some of those habits related to using data. So everything from, you know, organizing and asking the right questions, to then seeking out the information, using that information to take an action, and then understanding the results and starting the process all over again. You know, that's the basic articulation of how, you know, the thought process that goes into building an evidence-driven and, you know, by extension, data-driven mindset. Another thing that we talk about a lot when it comes to helping folks think about and understand how to engage with data more, you know, more intensely is thinking about it in terms of levels of inquiry, and create the ambition to move from lower levels of inquiry all the way to higher levels of inquiry. What those 3 levels are is first observe. That's something as simple as looking at, you know, the numbers and kind of taking them at face value. It's like, oh, I see, you know, 50% of students attended 90% or more of their classes. That would be an observation, you know, but we can usually go further, relating, you know, our observable data to the things we're experiencing or to other sources of information we know. So for example, right now we're in COVID, and so attendance rates are probably going to be very related to COVID rates. And so maybe a dip in attendance is telling us something about, you know, there are more families that are experiencing COVID and sickness, and we need to find ways to support more remote connection. That might be an example of relating data. And finally, there's the idea of inferring, using data to infer. And this is kind of making the more sophisticated conclusions, you know, using our observations from data, using everything else that we know, and using it to make inferences and conclusions about our actions, our programs, and how we can move to our ideal states. So what does this data mean for us? How can we change our behavior or advocate for something to really push the needle on this particular issue? So I think that's something that, you know, in a full workshop, we would spend time, you know, working through examples of, looking at specific data to try and go through those 3 levels. But just wanted to introduce this as an early topic that we would likely bring up. And the last topic I'll touch on related to upskilling or introducing people to concepts around data is this idea of data protocols. And this is particularly important when working collaboratively. These are just techniques that you might use to facilitate some kind of collaborative session related to working on data with other people. And you would choose a protocol or a technique based on what your goals are, the level of inquiry you're trying to focus on with your questions. And this could look like a variety of things. So for example, here in the middle, we have a data walk, which is where you might have posters on the wall if you were in an in-person setting, and people have a chance to individually look around the room, kind of reflect individually, and then you would come back together and discuss. That's just one protocol or technique you might use. And then there's others listed here as well. So again, not showing this to go into detail of these specific protocols or weigh the pros and cons of them, but just wanted to give a fast introduction to some of the concepts that we would share if we were doing, say, an hour-long workshop with a group of educators or, administrators, for example. So we'll pause there. Any thoughts or questions? If not, I have a question for all of you, which is that, is this something that feels like would be helpful for either yourself or your colleagues? Is this something that you think has value?
Can you repeat your question, Alexis?
I was just asking the group, Letty, if they felt like something like this, these materials would be helpful for folks in the community who might be working with data or have the opportunity to work with data in their roles.
It's a start. It's a start. Yeah, I think it's a start. Just like more like I'm looking at it like an assessment that they could do. You know what I'm saying? I'm looking at this as like a assessment tool. Based off of data. Like this could be something that could be done like every 6 months.
Yep, sure.
Because I always say that data always changes. So yeah, it's a start.
Yeah, that's a good point around when you think about data changing. I think an important thing to do is, for example, with these kind of protocols, no matter what kind of system you're using or reporting format you use, there could be a lot of value in regularly getting the community together, whether that's, educators, administrators, and families as well, to say, in the last 6 months, this is what's changed. This is, what we understand the data to mean now, and have people ask questions, offer different interpretations. I think there's a lot of value in doing things like that on a regular basis.
Throw it out there, y'all. What do you like? What do you not like? What do you have questions about? It would be really helpful to Alexis to get a couple other thoughts if you don't mind.
And I'm going to take these slides down so we can.
Yeah, Alexis, I have another question pertaining to this slide here. I'm sorry, you guys, if I'm not making room for anybody else to speak. But just to my question, would this be like, would this be used as far as like like based off of like families that is served?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Can you say that again?
Like would this be something that would be used like based off of the number of families that has been served or have used this, particular service?
Oh, I see. So in terms of if you're asking about health data, is that what you're asking?
Say that again.
Are you asking how we would collect data in terms of how many families are being served?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it would be focused on more point in time. So at the time that the data is collected, and it would be refreshed regularly, how many people, how many students were enrolled at that moment. And then, the next month, quarter, whatever the cadence is, how many students you have enrolled now, and then we can look and see, is it going up, is it going down, things like that. So it would be point in time. Great.
Alexis, would you break it down by age group as far as number enrolled, by infants, toddlers, preschool, school age?
Yeah, I think that would probably be an important categorization to the extent. So my bias is that the more we can collect, the better. And then that's when it goes into what I was saying about, it's one thing to have the data, it's another thing to also then have the capacity to sort through it all and analyze it and report on it. So we would have to, of course, prioritize what kind of analyses we do. But I think age is one of the fundamental demographic characteristics that we would want to track and be able to break things down by.
Okay, here's my next question.
Mhm.
I see Kaylin laughing at me. So once we have
If
all
it's
this
not you,
data-
it's me,
I
so
know.
it's all good.
So once we have this data block and we're going to revisit it, whatever frequency we choose, how are we going? We're going to disseminate it, but then how are we going to give this to providers? Like what is kind of the steps after that, and how do we make sure that the providers understand the meaning behind the data?
Absolutely, those are great questions. So there are a couple different models we could think about in terms of how exactly that works. The one that I am most familiar with and have discussed with Kaylin and others is based on the Chicago model, where they do something very similar. So I'll describe a little bit about what they do, and then the caveat that, we could decide that there need to be different changes for this community. But essentially the way it works in the Chicago system, which is it's been developed and is launching very soon, would be that I'm not exactly sure what the cadence is in terms of monthly versus quarterly, et cetera, but it's a cloud-based application, and each different provider group, so either individual provider, but mostly blocks of providers like Head Start, for example, authorize the system to access their data, whatever data system they use, and it all kind of gets put in one place. And so that each individual, it doesn't disappear from the provider side. They still have access and control over their own data, but it gets matched up with everyone else's. And then what gets sent back to the providers is a report that basically transforms their data into a standardized template and report that would show various fields. And again, we could decide based on what's available and what is of interest, highest priority, what that would look like in this community. But it would show things like, attendance trends. It would show things like how far students are traveling to get to the site. It would show, just the enrollment numbers. It would show things like workforce demographics. And in some cases, it would be able to benchmark those against what other providers, their data. So it wouldn't say, XYZ down the street has this score on this metric, but it would say compared to average providers in your community, this is how you stack up. So those are the kinds of things that they could potentially see. And then at the Chicago level, or at the community level, you're seeing things like what we've discussed. What's the total number of students enrolled across all the different providers? How does it break down by age, by ethnic group, by income level, those kinds of things. And then in terms of helping providers make good use of the data, I think that's a really important piece. And that was kind of why we walked through what could a potential training look like. Because there's going to be a wide range of existing comfort levels. I think there'll be people who are already using, a lot of tech and data collection in their own practices, are very comfortable with it. Folks who are, more manual in their practices right now. And so I think we would want and need to be able to have opportunities to support people at a variety of levels. So holding workshops is one, to the extent that there's ability, being able to match up with like one-to-one coaching if there's a particular provider that has a specific question. There are varieties of techniques that we could use, but the primary idea would just have to be to meet everyone where they are. You could use newsletters, other types of communication forums to send out tips or provide people with resources. But you probably have to be a little creative. Letty?
Yeah, I think you kind of answered my question, but just to make sure that I'm thinking clearly of what you're saying. So would this be based off of children's, off of, the children, or would this be based off of, would this be like data collected off the whole family, or just, the children that's like being enrolled, or that has, you know what I'm saying, just in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the model that I discussed, the Chicago model, as well as what's happening at the state level, is child level data. So meaning kind of one row for one child. However, I think what can be really important to help, one thing that would be helpful to know, and it would be helpful analysis to do, is to understand for each child what their household looks like. So for example, let's say, there's different columns of data for each child, their age, what program they go to, but then also you would have information about their family. Do they live with, one parent or two? Are their parents employed? Where do they live? What's their family's income level, et cetera, et cetera. And then for children who live in the same home, they would have the same data in those areas. You could have how many siblings they have. So then you could understand, for example, is there something unique about children living in one parent households versus multi-generational households versus with lots of siblings versus only children, those kinds of things. But you wouldn't necessarily, but the data would be at the level of the individual child versus the family.
Hi, Alexis. This is Danielle. So if I wanted to get the data information, would I have to go through a provider, or would an individual or family be able to just get it on their own?
Yeah, that's another great question. And that's also a decision that would have to be made, by the community or the group of people that are overseeing this process in the system. So what I can tell you is, so one thing is how Chicago does it, which is that once you have this central system, there's a relatively short list of people who, have, it's not open. It's not something that someone can just log online and see. In part because of that security concern of you have identifiable information, you have, confidential information. So the process is essentially that someone would have to make a specific request of, I want to use the data for this purpose. And they would go through a process of getting approved by the managing, overseeing board, and then their request would be approved, and then they would get access to a project space, it would be called, to do the analysis and view the data directly on this web-based portal. So they're not getting files sent to them to download. They're working directly on the system. And then again, if they wanted to, export their results, publish something, they would again have to get that approved. So that's more, it makes sense for like a researcher or like an institution. I'm not personally aware of what the conversations are for individuals or families. I think the idea would be that there would at regular intervals be more public facing reports that are published, and that would be more what families are engaging with. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility to think about and design a possible process for individuals to get some kind of access to the data system.
I do have one more question. So in looking at, we're going to know where these children are attending in their age groups. Do we have any information on how many children are actually in those areas so we can see what kind of slot gaps exist? Like if, let's say, one neighborhood has a higher concentration of children, but fewer of them are attending some kind of program, will we have information so we know like which areas to canvas to get
Absolutely.
them in early childhood?
So the way that would be done would be by matching against census data. So we would have to go, we would have as much specificity as the census has in terms of where families are, how many children they have, what ages they are. Of course, the census is not updated in real time, so there's it's not going to be perfect, but that would be the tool you would use to compare the number of students you have enrolled versus the number of students that are in the area. And the other thing I'll say on that, actually, just because I don't think I've clearly said this, is that this is the ideal state, of course, in terms of what we would have access to. And then of course we can change norms going forward about what information gets collected. But in terms of looking backwards, we're of course limited by what people are already collecting. So for example, if a center is not collecting how many siblings a student has, or what their home address is, or things like that, that's just not information we'd be able to have. But we could say, hey, these are questions that we as a collective want to answer going forward. So our request is that each provider collect this set of information. So that's just one thing to call out. Okay, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We have about 3 minutes left, but if anyone else has any thoughts or questions, you can of course still ask them here, or you can also email me separately. I'll put my email address in the chat now. But thank you all for your questions so far.
Thanks, everybody. I was going to say, I don't personally have anything else. My video's off because I was seeing a delay from what I heard in the other room. But it's lovely to see you all. And Alexis, feel free to close out whenever you're ready.
Okay. I'll take a final call for questions. Okay. Well, in that case, everyone, thank you for spending this time learning a little bit more about the work I'm doing, and I hope it sounds like something that will be a support for you and your work down the line, and all the work you do for the students and families of East St. Louis. So please, again, reach out if you have any questions, concerns, ideas, and this is the beginning of a longer process that this community will go through. So thanks again for your time, and then we'll see you again soon.